Well, good evening, everybody. As Pastor mentioned, today I will be delivering an apologetics presentation. And the reason for this is because last week in our study of Acts, we read about how Paul, in his quest to evangelize to the Lycaonians, made appeals to the world around them as a means to persuade them of God's existence. And in this sense, Paul was utilizing apologetics. And something else you'll notice about Paul is that he would tailor his approach and his message based on the people that he was speaking to. And similarly, we as Christians should tailor our approach and our message based on who we're speaking to. 1 Corinthians 9:20 through 22 says, "To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some." Now, I believe, as most others do, that in the modern age it is becoming increasingly important for us as Christians to be able to support and defend our faith, not just on spiritual and scriptural grounds, but also on scientific and philosophical grounds. And in this way, we can meet the unbeliever on terms that they are most comfortable with and on terms that they are most receptive to. Now, learning apologetics is not only useful in terms of evangelization, it's also useful for our own personal walk with Christ. And this is because in studying arguments and evidence for God's existence, we can acquire this sort of double warrant for our belief in God. The first and primary warrant being the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, but this secondary warrant in terms of arguments and evidence for his existence. And in this way, if we ever find ourselves doubting that God exists because maybe we're not feeling him in our lives like we would expect to, we can always lean on our intellectual grounding for our belief in God. Now today we'll be discussing an argument from natural theology. Natural theology is a branch of Christian theology that seeks to justify Christianity without appealing to inspired scripture. More specifically, the argument we'll talk about today is the so-called Cosmological argument. This name was dubbed by Dr. William Lane Craig, who is probably the most ardent proponent of this argument today. He's a very popular and influential Christian philosopher and apologist. So this argument seeks to prove that the universe began to exist, and in so, there is a transcendent creator of the universe. And what we'll find is that this argument is presented in the form of a simple syllogism. And what that means is that it is a series of premises that logically lead to a conclusion. It's also a deductive argument, which means that if we can show the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true necessarily. It's impossible for the conclusion to be false. So let's dive into the argument specifically, starting with the first premise: everything that begins to exist has a cause. Second premise: the universe began to exist, and the conclusion: therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, first, it should be noted that this argument is logically valid. And what that means, again, is that if we can show the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And this is important because the non-theist can't reject the conclusion simply because they don't like it. And so the question becomes, are these premises more plausibly true than false? And so that's what we'll discuss now, going through each of the premises, discussing what sort of support we have for them, what objections atheists might offer to them, and how we can respond to those objections. So first of all, what support do we have for the first premise, namely that everything that begins to exist has a cause? Well, we can say three things about this premise. First of all, and simply put, something cannot come from nothing. There is hardly a more basic philosophical principle than the principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. What we have to understand is that nothingness is not merely empty space. Nothingness is the absence of anything at all. It has no properties, no potentialities, no influence. So there's no reason whatsoever to believe that it could create anything to exist, including the universe. Secondly, if something can come from nothing, then it's inexplicable why anything and everything doesn't just pop into existence without a cause. Why don't we see cars or chairs or buildings just popping into existence without a cause? Of course, if we would expect that the universe could do this, then we would expect to see this happening all the time. But of course, we don't observe this. And this strongly disconfirms the idea that the universe could have existed or come into existence without a cause. And lastly, in common experience and in science, this premise is always verified and it is never falsified. So it's hard to believe how any person who claims to be devoted to modern science could possibly support such an idea without any evidence whatsoever to back their claim. So this is the primary support that we have for the first premise. And what sort of objections might the atheist offer to it? Well, one thing they might say is that particle physics has shown that subatomic particles can and do come into being without a cause from nothing. And in this sense, we show that something can come from nothing. It would therefore invalidate the first premise. And how can we respond to this objection? Well, we can say that their use of the word nothing is an improper use of the word. In no sense whatsoever are these subatomic particles coming into existence out of nothing. Rather, they're coming into existence out of the vacuum, and while the vacuum might sound like nothingness, it is anything but. It has energy, it has a physical structure, and it's governed by physical laws. So if you ever hear anybody say that particles can come into being from nothing, you can know that they are either unaware of the science or are otherwise being intentionally dishonest about it. So that objection fails. And moving on to the next objection, you might hear some atheists retort that if everything requires a cause for its existence, then what is the cause for God's existence? Now, first of all, such an objection does nothing to actually challenge the truth of the first premise. But nonetheless, it still fails to recognize what the first premise actually states. Notice that the first premise states everything that begins to exist has a cause. But of course, God, by definition, does not have a beginning. He is eternal and so beginningless. And in that sense, God is not subject to this premise. And outside of these objections to the support for the first premise, there's not much else that the atheist or anybody can do to try and refute it. It is an intuitively obvious premise and one which has much support. So with that, we'll move on to the second premise, namely that the universe began to exist. And this is the truly controversial premise. And with it, there's quite a lot to unpack. So first, I'll start with the philosophical support for the second premise, and then we'll look at what scientific evidence we have to support this premise as well. So, starting with the philosophical support, we can say that the universe must be finite in the past, because if the universe has no beginning, then that means there are an infinite number of days stretching back for eternity. But this sort of infinity is not possible in reality. And in order to understand this, we have to make a distinction between actual infinites and potential infinites. Now, a potential infinite is wholly possible. It simply serves as an ideal limit which we can approach but never actually reach. So, for example, you can imagine dividing a distance in half, and then into fourths, and then into eighths and sixteenths, and so on. And you can continue dividing this distance towards eternity, but you will never have actually divided the distance an infinite number of times. So in this sense, you can continue dividing towards infinity as an ideal limit, but you will never actually reach an infinite number of divisions. And as Christians, we actually view our lives similar to this, in that we have an absolute beginning, namely in our birth, but we believe that we will continue to live for eternity with Christ. And in that sense, we will always be approaching infinity, but we will never be an infinity number of years old. On the contrary, an actual infinite is not an ideal limit. It is not a concept of infinity where you can endlessly approach it but never actually reach it. Instead, an actual infinite is a complete set that contains an infinite number of members. So again, it's a complete set containing an infinite number of members. It's like a solid number that has no end. And this is the sort of infinity that would be required in order for the universe to be past eternal. Now, I know that it sounds strange, it maybe doesn't make sense, but that is entirely the point. And so when we apply this to real life, we'll see that certain absurdities would result that proves it's not actually possible for actual infinities to exist in reality. So let's consider this illustration as a means to prove that point. Imagine that for every one orbit around the sun that Saturn completes, Jupiter completes 2 orbits. Now we can imagine that if these planets were orbiting the sun for a finite amount of time, then Jupiter will always have completed twice as many orbits as Saturn. And the longer that they are orbiting the sun, the greater the disparity between the 2 planets in terms of the number of orbits they've completed becomes. But now let's imagine instead that these planets have been orbiting the sun from eternity past, without beginning. Then we can ask, how many orbits have these planets completed? And the answer mathematically is that they've completed an identical number of orbits, namely, they both completed an infinite number of orbits. But of course, this seems absurd because we know that Jupiter must have completed twice as many orbits as Saturn. In fact, if they have been orbiting the sun for an infinite amount of time, then we should expect that Jupiter will have completed infinitely many more orbits than Saturn. But again, that's not what the case is. It turns out that they've completed an infinite number of orbits, both of them have, which means they're identical in terms of how many orbits they've completed. But it makes no sense whatsoever that just by increasing the number of orbits they complete, that they magically become identical in terms of how many orbits they've completed. And so this exemplifies just how absurd an actual infinite would be if extended into reality. We can take this a step further even and say that if the universe has no beginning, and is past eternal, then today could not ever have been reached. And here's why. We can view the series of past events in the universe as being or coming into existence by adding one member after another. But you can't pass through an actual infinite through successive addition. And what I mean by this can be, so let's consider an analogy. So imagine that every past day in the universe is a domino, right? And if the universe is finite, and it has an absolute beginning, then there is a first domino, namely the first moment of the universe. And we can knock that domino over, and the rest of the dominoes will continue to fall until we reach the final domino, which is today. But instead, let's imagine that the universe has no beginning. Now, if the universe has no beginning, there is no possible way for us to begin making our way to today, because there is no place at which we can start. Every time you try to knock over that first domino, you will always find that there's another domino before that one, and then another before that one, and so on for eternity. And so what you'll find, it's like trying to jump out of a literally bottomless pit. You have no leverage and no place at which you can begin. And this is true, by the way, of any particular moment in an infinite past. You can't reach any of them when you consider it in terms of this argument. And of course, though, we know that today does exist. We know it because we're living it right now. And this point strongly disproves the idea that the universe is past eternal. And so that is the philosophical support for this second premise. And now let's consider what sort of objections might be offered against this philosophical evidence. Well, one of the few objections you might hear is that these absurdities only result because we don't understand an actual infinite well enough. But this objection is simply false. The reason that these absurdities do result is precisely because of the fact that we understand actual infinites so well. The branch of modern mathematics which deals with actual infinites, it's called transfinite arithmetic, is a very well-developed branch of modern mathematics. So this objection simply fails. And outside of that, there really isn't much more that can be said about the philosophical support. The philosophical evidence is incredibly strong, and there are remarkably few objections to it. And even if we wanted to avoid the scientific evidence for the second premise, we could probably do that, because with the philosophical evidence alone, we have enough to prove the truth of this premise. Nonetheless, there is quite a bit scientific evidence to prove the second premise as well, and that's what we'll turn to now, starting with the expansion of the universe.
How does that relate to the domino effect?
I'm sorry?
How does that relate to the domino effect? One is absolute, and the domino effect is not absolute. How do the two relate to each other?
Okay, so the point of the illustration was to show that if the universe doesn't have a beginning, then trying to traverse that infinite amount of time to reach today is not possible, because there is no conceivable beginning point at which you can begin making your way. On the other hand, if the universe does have an absolute beginning, then you don't run into this issue, because there is a first domino.
But there's no proof that there is a beginning date, right? There's no proof.
Well, that's actually what we're going to discuss now.
Okay.
What sort of scientific evidence we have to support the claim that the universe began to exist. So that's what we'll go ahead and look at now. Again, starting with the expansion of the universe. Now, in the 1920s, Edwin Hubble confirmed prior theories which postulated that the universe is in a state of expansion. What he found is that the light coming from distant galaxies was all redshifted. And what that means is if there's redshifted light, the objects which are producing that light are expanding away from us. Kind of similar to the Doppler effect. You know, when you hear a car or a siren passing by you, and it has a different pitch when it's coming towards you than when it's going away from you. That's the same thing, but in regards to light. The length or the wavelengths of the light get stretched out as it moves away from you. And that's what causes it to shift towards the red spectrum.
Now some sirens sped up faster. Like the police sirens, they're a lot faster than the ambulance sirens.
Maybe so, but you'll notice that when they pass you, the pitch of the siren changes. And that's the same principle behind redshifted light. So anyway, like we were saying, the expansion of the universe was proved through the observations made by Edwin Hubble. And it's interesting, and it might sound simple, but if you simply reverse the expansion of the universe, what you'll find is as you head backwards in time, you will reach a point where the universe becomes so dense that any 2 points, or the distance between any 2 points, becomes zero. And at this moment, you've reached the beginning of the universe. This is the boundary of time and space prior to which nothing else existed. So I think that we have an illustration sort of to help get the idea across. So you can imagine this as the universe, which is expanding as time moves forward. And all you have to do is think, what would happen if we trace this backwards in time? And as you find, similar to a cone, you will eventually reach a point where it contracts so much that you can't go back any further. And this serves as evidence that the universe has a beginning point. And it's true regardless of what cosmology you hold to.
Now,
is there going to be questions and answers after?
Yeah, we'll have questions and answers afterwards as well.
Sorry.
Yeah, so as soon as I finish the talk, we'll go through all of whatever questions you guys might have.
good.
Anyway, though, so this is good evidence that the universe has a beginning. Additionally, the second law of thermodynamics also lends support to this second premise. The second law of thermodynamics states that processes going on in a closed system are always heading towards a state of disorder. This is because there are more ways to achieve disorder than there are ways to achieve order. Sometimes this disorder is referred to as entropy. Now, given enough time for entropy to accrue in the universe, you will eventually reach a point of thermodynamic equilibrium. And what this means is that there's so much disorder that all of the energy and matter in the universe is equally distributed. The thermodynamic equilibrium is also referred to as the heat death of the universe, because at this point, the universe will have grown entirely cold and it won't be possible for life to exist anywhere in the cosmos. But of course, if the universe were past eternal, then we should expect to see that we've already reached this heat death state. But of course, we don't observe that, which is obvious through the trivial observation that we are alive, we do exist. And of course, the measurements that we take of the universe are not at all indicative of a universe that has been existing from eternity past. Again, if that were the case, then certainly by now, we would have had enough time to have reached the heat death state of the universe. And so this provides also good evidence that the universe began to exist. So, with the scientific evidence in mind, what sort of objections can we expect to receive from the atheist in order to debunk it? Well, the 19th century physicist Boltzmann suggested that the universe is actually currently in a state of this thermodynamic equilibrium, in a state of this heat death. But by chance alone, there formed a pocket of disequilibrium where life could exist, and we find ourselves in one of these pockets. And this was referred to as the many worlds hypothesis. Now, in response to this, we can say that this model has been widely rejected by contemporary scientists and philosophers because of the fact that if it were true that we are in one of these pockets of disequilibrium, then why is it that we observe that we are in such a large pocket of disequilibrium when a much smaller pocket is inconceivably more probable and would allow us to exist? In fact, if you hold to this model, then you encounter a really bizarre scenario where it's far more likely that we really do exist in a smaller pocket of disequilibrium, and we're all just having the collective illusion that we're existing in a larger pocket of disequilibrium the size of our observable universe. But of course, nobody believes this, and these are the reasons why the many worlds hypothesis has been largely rejected. Now, the atheist may also object that our universe is only one universe that is part of a much larger reality in which there are many other universes all residing in a false vacuum, sometimes referred to as the mother universe. And this view is what you've heard called the multiverse theory, or the multiverse hypothesis, I shouldn't say theory. And on this view, they may say that even though our universe requires a beginning, and our universe is subject to the second law of thermodynamics, that does nothing to show that the multiverse as a whole is subject to the second law of thermodynamics, or that the multiverse had an absolute beginning. So how can we respond to the multiverse objection? Now, first of all, whether or not the multiverse is subject to the second law of thermodynamics is not known by any means. But that aside, we still know for certain that the multiverse must have a beginning to its existence. And this is aside from the philosophical evidence we looked at a moment ago. But the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem has proven that any universe which is on average expanding in its past cannot be past eternal, but must have a finite beginning. Now remember, on the multiverse, there is a mother universe in which all of these bubble universes, of which ours is one, are residing. And according to the multiverse hypothesis, this mother universe must also be expanding. And that's because the expansion of this mother universe is the mechanism by which these smaller bubble universes are created. But in this case, since the multiverse is expanding, or the mother universe is expanding, we know that it, as well as our own universe, must have a finite beginning because it is subject to the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Now, atheists have tried to avoid the conclusion of this argument by postulating things like oscillating models, or models in which the arrow of time travels in two directions. But these models have been shown to be either scientifically untenable or are otherwise unable to escape an absolute beginning of the universe, even if they are assumed to be true. In 2015, Alexander Vilenkin stated concerning models of the past eternal universe that the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem gives us reason to believe that such models simply cannot be constructed. Secondly, the question of whether the multiverse actually exists still remains. And as far as we currently know, there is no compelling reason to believe that it does. The evidence for the multiverse is wholly speculative, as it's dependent upon the properties of the initial field that is responsible for inflation, of which we have no real knowledge. Oftentimes, the multiverse is utilized as this sort of surrogate deity that people can use in order to avoid an absolute beginning or to avoid the fine-tuning of the universe. And finally, the multiverse hypothesis encounters a devastating objection known as the Boltzmann brains. So the issue here is actually somewhat similar to the issue with the many worlds hypothesis, but it's a bit confusing, and it goes like this. It is unfathomably more probable that a single brain would fluctuate into existence that has the illusion of an external world rather than a universe with real stars, planets, galaxies, and other conscious agents actually existing. These brains with the illusory observations are what we call Boltzmann brains. Now, in fact, on the multiverse hypothesis, the vast majority of observable worlds in the multiverse will be these sort of illusory worlds, where a single brain fluctuates into existence that is having the illusions of an external world. So if you hold to the multiverse hypothesis, then you should believe that you are a Boltzmann brain. But of course, nobody anywhere believes that they're a Boltzmann brain. And if the price of atheism is to accept that you're a Boltzmann brain, then atheism is truly bankrupt. Now, outside of these objections to the second premise, there are a few others that we could discuss, but in reality, they're not very difficult to refute. And for the most part, they make no ground in terms of proving that the second premise is false. And so in that sense, we can comfortably say that both the first and second premise of this argument are more plausibly true than they are false. And if that's the case, we can also say, because it's a deductive argument, that the conclusion is more plausibly true than false. And so, at this point, we should consider what the cause or the attributes of the cause of the universe must be. So first of all, we can say that the cause of the universe must be uncaused. And that's because we can't have an infinite regress of causes. Secondly, the cause must be timeless and spaceless, because whatever created the universe created time and space. Thirdly, the cause must be immaterial and non-physical, because material and physical things only exist within the universe. Fourthly, the cause must be incredibly powerful, since it created the universe with no material cause. And finally, the cause must be a personal being with freedom of the will. And this one's a bit confusing, so here's the explanation behind that. If the cause is sufficient to produce its effect, then if the cause is there, the effect should also be there. It doesn't make sense that you can get a non-permanent or temporal effect from a permanent cause unless the permanent cause has the ability to choose to do something. In other words, it's not possible for a non-personal cause to choose to create the universe only a finite time ago. However, it is possible for a personal being with freedom of the will to spontaneously choose to create the universe only a finite time ago. So in all, we see that the cause of the universe must be uncaused, it is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, non-physical, incredibly powerful, and is a personal agent with freedom of the will. And as Thomas Aquinas remarks, this is what everybody means by God. So that is the Cosmological argument, at least in its basic form.